Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your kind invitation to address you today. I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I'm very grateful for modern technology, which makes it possible for me to share some of this news with you. I've been asked to speak to you this morning from a passage in the New Testament from the Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 24, verse 14 of this Gospel. Jesus said, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then will the end come." What I'd like to do is to update you on how well we're doing in terms of the advance of the gospel worldwide and what is actually happening in the development of the global church. First of all, I'd like to tell you some of the encouragements of what God is doing around the world. My own background is as a historian, and if you look at history over the last 25 years, it's undeniable that it's been one of the most remarkable times in the history of the church across the world. I know you don't always feel that within Denmark because it's quite hard to stand up and be counted as a Christian here. But if you look at the world as a whole, we've been through a time of unprecedented growth of the church and the number of authentic followers of Jesus Christ all around the world. The church has become truly global. I wonder if you can guess what are the 5 countries with the largest numbers of people who aspire to be biblical Christians and followers of Jesus around the world. I'm sure you'll choose USA, but what would you say are the other 4 countries? You may be surprised to hear that they are Nigeria, which is in Africa, India, in South Asia, China, where there are apparently 60 million Bible-believing Christians, at least. Some people say it's more than that. And the 5th country would be Brazil, in Latin America. Now, what does that show us? It shows us that none of the 5 largest churches in the world are European. They're in other parts of the world on 5 different continents. And that growth has been quite spectacular over the last 25 years, in part because of a political event which happened before some of you were born, or around about the time you were born, in 1989, when the fall of the Berlin Wall occurred in East Germany, and many countries in Eastern Europe opened up to the advance of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That political change also opened the way for the advance of the gospel in many other countries where there were totalitarian systems of government. Let me give you 2 or 3 other examples. Ethiopia, which I believe many of you are aware of because it's one of the countries that the Danish Lutheran Mission is engaged in, is probably the fastest growing student movement in the world. I was visiting Ethiopia a few years back, and I met a friend of mine from Sweden who was teaching there, and he said, "Linsey, the last 6 years we've baptized 200,000 new followers of Jesus Christ every year." The student movement has grown from 5,000 students 10 years ago to 25,000 students involved in Bible study groups in universities and campuses all across the country. Another country would be Nepal. The first Christian missionaries went to Nepal in 1954, not much more than 50 years ago, nearly 60 now. In 1991, there were perhaps 30,000 known Christians in the country. There's been remarkable growth in the last 20 years, and now it's said that there are 900,000 followers of Jesus Christ in Nepal. In fact, I was talking to one Nepali friend recently, and I said, "There's been spectacular growth in your country, in the life of the church in recent years. Why do you think that's happened?" And he said, "Well, a lot of ministers or pastors were imprisoned in the early 1990s, and so that encouraged ordinary members of the church to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. But there is something special going on in the country, which we call revival." One pastor told me that in his church, they don't bother to go out into the open air to speak. They just open the windows and the doors, they sing, and people just come in off the streets. That's revival, where the church is growing rapidly. Another country would be Mongolia, where there were only 3 or 4 known Christians in 1990. Now there are close to 200 churches across the country. Algeria in North Africa, where the great church leader Saint Augustine came from in the 5th century. In the year 2000, there were only 1,000 believers. Now there are somewhere in the region of 80 to 90,000. In fact, I was talking with a couple of Algerian Christians when I was with them in North Africa, in Tunisia, a couple of years ago, and the phone went, the mobile phone of one of them. It was his wife. She said, I think you'd better come home. The other 2 leaders in the church were taken in by the secret police for questioning last night. He excused himself and said, I'm sorry, I'll have to go home to try to help the other 2 leaders and to speak to the police. So he returned home, and he sent me an email subsequently saying that he'd been taken in for questioning by the police as well, and they had said to him, don't you realize that we have the power to imprison you? If you don't stop preaching Jesus Christ and turning the place upside down, we'll imprison all you Christians. And he said, I just smiled or laughed and said, it's too late. You could have done it 10 years ago when there were 1,000 of us, but now we're 80,000. You don't have that many places in prison. So that's an indication of how the church is growing in North Africa also. Another country would be Albania. Albania used to be the only country in the world which said that it was atheistic in its constitution. And the work grew there amazingly. In the early 1990s, when the president of the country died, Enver Hoxha, it was an atheistic state. At that time, during the summer months, a group of students from Seattle in North America were flying overnight to go on a summer program in what was Yugoslavia. They arrived in Athens in Greece and were just about to change planes when they looked at the television screen in the airport, and they could see that there was fighting breaking out on the streets of Belgrade, the capital of what was Yugoslavia, as the country began to disintegrate. So they phoned back to their pastor and said, their youth minister, and said, look, it's too risky to go to Belgrade. Maybe we shouldn't go there because war is breaking out. Can we go anywhere else? He said, watch the next item in the news. It's about the death of the leader in Albania. There's chaos there. Everything is open. Catch the next flight into Tirana, the capital. They said, where's Albania? He said, well, it's just a bit further north from Greece. Get a plane there, go to the university, offer to teach English as a foreign language, and use the Bible as the text to share with people. So the 10 of them went. For 6 weeks they taught English through the medium of the Bible. About 10 students became Christians, and out of that came the student movement, which is today all across the country. One of those who became a Christian was a very gifted linguist, and about 6 or 7 years later he realized there wasn't a very good translation of the Bible into Albanian, so he took a year off his work, learned New Testament Greek, and translated the whole of the New Testament into the Albanian language. All of that came from a summer team. So these are wonderful examples of how the church is becoming genuinely global, and how in our generation we can see what Jesus meant when he talked about preaching this message in the whole world. It was a far-off dream when he was around, but here you can see the church becoming genuinely global with this dramatic growth. Also, the number of missionaries from the non-Western world is growing. I was talking with a Nigerian the other day, and I said to him, how many Nigerian missionaries are there in the world? And he said, well, Linsey, 20 years ago there were 5,000 Western missionaries in Nigeria and 500 Nigerians in Europe. He said, now there are 5,000 Nigerians in Europe and 500 Westerners in Nigeria, and we have missions conferences for students with 6,000 students turning up. Same things happening in many other countries like Ghana and Ethiopia and India and Korea, where students your age are beginning to see that when Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel, he was speaking to them as much as he was to Western nations like the USA or the UK. So all across the world over these last 20 years we've seen very significant growth, except perhaps for the context of Europe, which is a tough country. What, however, are some of the challenges which have been facing us? I'd like to suggest 4 for your consideration. The first is the challenge of pluralism and relativism, its first cousin. Pluralism is the idea that there is no one truth and that there are many ways to truth. Relativism is the idea that everything is relative, there's no such thing as absolute truth, and you know that someone is relativistic when they say, if that works for you, that's fine, this is what works for me. There's nothing absolutely true. Now that's the idea that permeates many of our cultures. That's a great challenge facing us today, perhaps the number one in Europe as we seek to bear witness to Jesus Christ. The second, globally, is the growth of what we call religious fundamentalism. That is the growth of many aspects of Islam which is hostile to the Christian faith, but not just Islam. In India we have Hindu fundamentalism, where Hindus are wanting to push non-Hindus out of the country or out of positions of responsibility and adopt Hinduism as the national faith of the Indian continent, even though there are perhaps 30 million Christians there. Now, in the early 1990s, there was an American guy from a Japanese background called Francis Fukuyama, who rather foolishly wrote a book called The End of History. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, he said democracy is won, communism is defeated, history is over, we've reached our goal. It wasn't, of course, true. It was rather naive. 10 years later, another guy called Samuel Huntington wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations, in which he almost prophetically wrote that your generation will be characterized by a clash between great religious movements like Islam and Christianity. And that's actually what we're seeing in the world at the moment, with the impact of Iran, Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East, and Al-Qaeda and other groups causing terroristic threats in different parts of the world. The third challenge, however, is the growth in persecution. The strange thing is, persecution of Christians, the strange thing is that as the church grows, just as in the New Testament, the persecution of Christians grows. Even if it's not overt hostile persecution, sometimes it comes at the realm of ideas. For example, you may be finding in Denmark that in your culture, people are trying to prevent Christians from freely holding their views in terms of following Jesus Christ. But in some areas of Europe and the wider world, there is overt hostility. Let me give a couple of examples. A friend of mine comes from Eritrea, that's in East Africa, just north of Ethiopia. Now in Eritrea, communism still holds sway. And this young woman whom I know who was there told me that some terrible things have happened to Christian leaders there. She said that the communist government has taken some pastors, put them in a big container and just put them underground where they've smothered to death. She said her own husband has had to spend months away from home because he's being chased by the authorities. In the war between Eritrea and Ethiopia, the government is often sending lots of pastors to the war front, and they push them to the front so that when there's firing, they're amongst the first who are killed. So it's tough in Eritrea. Even in northern Nigeria, it's difficult. I was talking with one Nigerian young guy who was only about 30 the other day, and I asked him what he was doing. He said he was a missionary in the north of the country amongst Muslims, and he'd become the first Christian in his village when he was about 13. I said, how did that happen? He said some Christians came through the village and they were giving out leaflets. I picked up one and read it. I became a Christian. I went home and told my father. And this may seem a shock to you, but he said my father picked up a gun and tried to shoot me because he was a Muslim. He missed me and accidentally shot my brother. Then he shot me in the leg. And then my mother jumped on top of him to try and stop him from killing us. And other men from the village came in and tried to prevent him too. I said, what did you do? He said, well, I stayed in the family and I tried to live a distinctive Christian life and speak to my father. Till 6 years later, he became a Christian. He told the leading elders in this Muslim village what had happened, and they said, you've got 24 hours to give this up. He said, I don't need 24 hours, I know it's true. I've been watching my son all this time. And he said, in that case, they killed him. They killed his father. because his testimony is a Christian. Then in Iraq, I met another young guy a few years ago. His name, well, I won't share his name for security reasons, but I'd met him years earlier when he was a medical student. He came to some conferences we had in the Middle East. And on this occasion, I was in Jordan, next to Israel. He had crossed the border from Iraq, and he turned up at our meeting without a passport. And I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well, we've had a terrible experience in my family. Muslim leaders warned my father not to go to the church downtown, or me at the same time. They said they'd kidnap and kill us. So my father said, from now on, we go separately." We went separately, and my father was kidnapped and killed. So my mother said, "Please leave the country. I couldn't face it if I lost my husband and my son." So he said, "I've come across the border." Then there was an American with me who said to him, "When you think of what happened to your father, do you blame Western soldiers from the US or from the UK for what happened to your father?" Then I was very struck when he said, "I don't blame anyone. When I read the New Testament, I just read the words of Jesus where he says, all those who are godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. That's what happened to my father." And then I said to him, "What are you going to do now?" He said, "I don't know what I'll do now. I don't have a passport. I'm not able to practice medicine. What I do know is I want to follow Christ just as my father did, whatever the cost." So here are examples of people in the modern world, not much older than yourself, who are standing firm in following Christ despite hostility and persecution. But fourthly and finally, the other thing which is bringing a challenge to us is the new atheism espoused by Richard Dawkins and other science professors, who are trying to say that the Christian faith is not just wrong or foolish, but they're saying it's evil and should be eradicated. And so you may have come across some of their books, which some of your friends in school are reading. The response we need to engage in with these people is we need to stand up and demonstrate and speak about the truth claims of the Christian gospel. Well, I must close in a few minutes, but let me just leave with you three perhaps challenges which you may wish to pray about as far as the global church is concerned. The first is the challenge of the university world. You know, Martin Luther said in the 1520s, if you want to change the world, start with the university. It's the seedbed of ideas. Most people work out their framework for belief and action before they're 25, and they flesh that out the rest of their lives. So the university and high schools are a key place between the ages of 15 and 25 when people are working out their framework for life. That's why you're in a great position to share your testimony of how you've come to follow Jesus Christ with your classmates. Because if people become followers of Jesus when they're in their late teens or early 20s, there's the potential for them to serve him, speak for him, and live for him for 50 years. So don't be shy, be courageous in reaching out to your friends in university. That's one of the challenges. A second would be unreached people groups. In this passage, Jesus talks about the gospel being preached to all nations. Now, excuse me, it used to be thought that when we read that word nation, it meant nation state. Denmark is a nation state. Germany is a nation state. France is a nation state. But the idea of a nation state only came in a couple of hundred years ago. The word that Jesus is using there is the word ethne, which means a people group defined by a distinctive language. If you interpret it in those terms, there are many thousands of ethne or ethnic groups that have their own distinctive language, which is unique to them. And actually there are 639 of these people groups or ethnic groups where over 100,000 people speak the language, and they've never seen a missionary, they've never had a New Testament, they don't have any churches, they don't have really any religious tracts, they don't have any Christian songs. These unreached people groups are still to be reached. Now, when we discovered the term 30 years ago, many Christian missionaries went to unreached people groups, but we still have these 600 plus groups of 100,000 people each. We talk about the second coming of Jesus. They haven't heard about the first coming. This passage refers to the second coming of Christ. But they need to hear about his first coming. The third challenge is Bible translation. There are nearly 7,000 languages in the world. Only 2,500 of them have portions of Scripture. There's still great need. But the good news is there are many agencies working on Bible translation, and they have what they call 2020 vision. They're praying that the Bible will begin to be translated in the remaining languages, the major languages of the world where it's not currently available, by the year 2020. That will be a great thing to be involved in and a great thing to pray for. The last thing I would say is the importance of what we call the diaspora, or you may know it as the immigrant community. All over the world, you know, because of economic turmoil and other reasons, people are leaving their home countries and traveling elsewhere. Now, when we see the news, we see the problems of immigrants often moving into countries and being criticized as taking jobs or whatever. But actually, in God's providence, it's one of the ways that the church is growing around the world. And I'd like to close with one story about this for your encouragement from Saudi Arabia. A friend of mine was traveling there. You know, it's a Muslim country. It's punishable by death to become a follower of Jesus. And this friend of mine knew a Saudi Arabian family. She went to visit them. The wife and the family, they were quite wealthy, said, "Would you come downstairs, Vivian, and see this new room which we've built for use in our home?" So my friend said, okay, out of courtesy. She went downstairs, they flicked the light switch on, and there were about 70 people in the room. And my friend said to this Saudi Arabian woman, "Who are all these people?" She said, "I told them that you would come and explain the message of Jesus to them from the Gospels." And my friend Vivian said, "But that's illegal in the country. Where have all these people come from?" She said, "Well, you know that I've got a maid from the Philippines, a Filipina maid. She came to work for me 3 years ago. She was always singing in a language I didn't understand, her own language, Tagalog. And she was very joyful. So one day I said to her, 'What are you singing about?' She said to me, 'I'm singing songs of praise to Jesus, who is my Savior and Lord, the Son of my life.' And she said, 'Well, if it's giving you joy, I'd like to find out more about Jesus myself. Tell me.' So the Filipina maid told her, and she said, 'I became a follower of Jesus. Then I told my husband and my children. Then we told our neighbors and our extended family, and here they all are. They're not yet followers of Jesus, but they are seekers. And it's all happened because this one Filipina maid came to live here in Saudi Arabia and shared the gospel with us.' So when you see those critical news reports about the problems arising from immigration, it is right that we consider how to manage that properly. At the same time, pray that God would use the movement of peoples across the world contribute to the advance of the gospel, so that in your lifetime, hopefully, we might see that the gospel is preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and the end will come. Thank you for listening. God bless you, and have a wonderful conference.